K2 is one of the most dangerous mountains on Earth. For every 4 climbers that reach the top, 1 climber never makes it back down. Hidden crevasses, fragile snow ledges. And if you've made it past this part of the mountain, you face the infamous bottleneck, a vertical death trap that claimed lives of the most experienced mountaineers on Earth. Here are some of the most horrific incidents ever caught on camera, and things only keep getting worse. Serge Dessureau wasn't just any climber. He was a man who lived for challenges. As a respected firefighter, he had saved countless lives back home, but on the world's highest peaks, it was his own life on the line. Having already conquered Everest, Serge set his sights on K2. The Canadian team he led was experienced and well prepared. They chose the Abruzzi Spur, the classic route up K2, known for its steep rock faces and deadly bottlenecks. The climb was grueling, the air was thin, and every breath a struggle. Day by day, Serge and his team pushed higher, setting camp after camp, acclimatizing to the brutal conditions. But Serge was calm and focused, the kind of leader who inspired confidence even in the harshest moments. His teammates trusted him. But then came July 7th. The team reached one of K2's most notorious obstacles, House's Chimney. This narrow vertical gully of rock and ice is a choke point on the route, where even the smallest mistakes can decide between life and death. Serge took the lead, climbing carefully, testing every handhold, every foothold. They moved slowly up the mountain, but out of nowhere, everything changed. Serge's crampon slipped on the icy rock. His balance faltered. He reached for the rope, but gravity took hold. He fell and plummeted over 500 feet down the mountain's face. Climbers below captured the fall on camera. The footage shows something falling down the steep ridge. The owner of the original video at first stated that this was the body of the Canadian climber.
Hi Cribba, how are you doing? Okay, everybody okay up there?
But to this day, many still believe that it was only Serge's gloves visible in the video, not his actual body. His teammates up on the mountain were left in stunned silence, unable to believe what had just happened. There was no time to react, no way to somehow save him. They could only watch helplessly as their group leader was falling to his death. The expedition was called off immediately. The surviving climbers descended and later faced the grim task of recovering Serge's body in conditions that were as dangerous as the climb itself. When the tragic news hit his hometown, the devastation was huge. Serge was more than a climber. He was a man who had dedicated his life to protecting others. But on this fateful day on K2, he unfortunately failed to protect himself. His body was eventually recovered weeks later near the main route and airlifted to safety. In 1986, a British team set out to make history on K2. Among them were Alan Rouse and Julie Tullis. Alan Rouse was a legend in the British climbing community. Known for his boldness and unyielding determination, Alan had already made a name for himself on some of the world's toughest peaks. His reputation was built on pushing limits and facing danger head-on. Tullis was equally remarkable, a pioneering female mountaineer and filmmaker, determined to document the raw, unfiltered reality of high-altitude climbing. Together, they joined a British team with a single goal: to conquer the world's second highest mountain. The expedition was grueling from the start. K2's weather was notoriously unpredictable, and the team faced relentless storms and bone-chilling cold. Each day was a battle against the constant threat of avalanches and rockfall. But after weeks of struggle, the team finally reached the summit. It was a moment of pure triumph, a testament to human will and perseverance. But on K2, reaching the summit is only half the battle. As Alan, Julie, and the others began their descent, the weather switched in a matter of minutes. A fierce storm swept in, trapping them above 8,000 meters, deep inside the death zone where the air is too thin to sustain life for long. The storm was relentless, with blizzard conditions and freezing temperatures that made every breath a struggle. Supplies dwindled, oxygen ran out, and the climbers were forced to hunker down, hoping to wait out the worst. Julie was the first to falter. The altitude sickness and exhaustion overwhelmed her. She collapsed, unable to continue. Alan refused to leave her side. For days they clung to each other, fighting to survive in a place where survival seemed impossible. Their faces, captured in haunting photographs and video footage, tell a story of pain and their desperate will to come down alive. Alan's condition deteriorated as well, as frostbite and delirium set in. Despite his weakening state, he continued to support Julie and the others, embodying the spirit of leadership and camaraderie. But the mountain was merciless. Eventually, Alan collapsed in the snow as well, his body succumbing to the very mountain he had fought so hard to conquer. Around him, the rest of the group was also struggling to survive. Julie Tullis, already weakened by exhaustion and altitude sickness, had collapsed earlier in their small tent. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her breathing shallow, her strength fading with each passing hour. The other climbers, Polish, Austrian, and British members of the multinational group, were huddled together, desperate for warmth and oxygen, rationing what little supplies they had left. Communication broke down. Some tried to comfort Julie, but there was little anyone could do. One by one, the climbers' conditions worsened. After hours of struggling to somehow survive, Julie passed away in silence, her body finally giving in to the brutal conditions. By the time the weather cleared and rescue from the lower camp became possible, 5 climbers, including Alan and Julie, had already lost their lives. Rescue teams later tried to reach their bodies, but the extreme altitude and dangerous conditions made recovery impossible. Alan, Julie, and some of the other climbers still remain on the mountain to this day. And this wasn't the last time the mountain turned deadly, because years later, K2 would claim another climber, and this time, one of the world's most skilled mountaineers. In February 2021, a man named Ali Sadpara set out to challenge K2 in a way no one had ever done before, by attempting the first ever summit during the winter months. Ali was a legend in the mountaineering world. Known as a humble man with an iron will, he had already conquered 8 of the world's 14 highest peaks, earning respect for his skill, endurance, and unshakable spirit. For him, climbing was more than a sport, it was his life. The winter ascent of K2 was the last great prize in high-altitude mountaineering, and Ali was determined to claim it. The winter of 2020 was brutal. Temperatures plunged well below -50 degrees, and fierce winds howled through the mountain's ridges. Many had tried and failed to summit during the winter months, beaten back by the savage cold and relentless storms. But Ali, along with a small team of climbers, refused to give up. As they ascended, the mountain tested them at every turn. The terrain was treacherous, they battled steep ice walls and unstable snowfields. But Ali was more determined than ever before. On February 5th, his team was last seen near the summit. Their headlamps flickered in the darkness, a faint glow against the black sky. Drones and fellow climbers captured footage of their final push, images filled with hope and tension as the team battled the mountain's unforgiving conditions. But out of nowhere, radio contact was lost. Days passed without a single trace of Ali and his teammates. Rescue teams launched desperate searches, combing the mountain for any sign of the missing climbers. But K2 held its secrets tightly. The mountain's brutal winter conditions made rescue nearly impossible, and the search was called off. Only months later could the bodies of Ali Sadpara and his teammates be found high up on the mountain, frozen in place. The discovery confirmed the worst fears. The first winter ascent of K2 had ended in a fatal disaster. On July 26, 2021, Ali Sadpara's son, Sajid Sadpara, was guided by a team of Sherpas to his father's body. They brought him down the mountain and gave him a final resting place in peace. And while this case took the life of only 3 people, the next would bring death to more than 11 climbers. In the summer of 2008, teams from around the globe gathered at over 8,000 meters, all hoping to reach the summit of K2. The plan was for a coordinated push, but from the start, the ascent was plagued by delays and uncertainty. The night before, climbers barely slept, nerves frayed by the knowledge that the infamous bottleneck stood between them and the summit. The plan was for the strongest Sherpas and high-altitude porters to fix ropes through the bottleneck before sunrise, but confusion over who would carry the ropes and who would lead the fixing caused a crucial delay. As the first climbers set out in the early morning hours of August 1st, the line of climbers stretched out along the mountain face. The pace was slow. Bottlenecks formed not just at the bottleneck itself, but at earlier technical sections, as teams waited for ropes to be fixed. The cold was biting, and every step above 8,000 meters was a challenge itself. Pemba and other Sherpas worked tirelessly, moving up and down to fix ropes and guide climbers. The process was agonizingly slow. Some climbers, like Marco Confortola, were standing for hours, waiting for their turn to climb the bottleneck. The crowding and delays meant that instead of summiting in the early afternoon, many climbers were still below the bottleneck late into the day. But instead of turning back, they kept pushing for the summit. One by one, they clipped into the fixed ropes, inching upward, aware that a single mistake or a falling chunk of ice from the serac could be fatal. By the time the first climbers reached the summit, the sun was already dipping low. At approximately 3:55 p.m., Pemba Sherpa, Marco Confortola, and members of the Korean and Norwegian teams stood on top of K2. Flags were unfurled, photos taken, and brief words exchanged. Hours later, Ger McDonnell and a few other climbers finally summited as evening shadows stretched across the Karakoram. It was a short moment of triumph, but also a warning that time was running out. After a short break at the summit, they tried to descend as fast as they possibly could, but K2 had other plans. Because as darkness swept in over the death zone, a massive chunk of the serac broke off above the bottleneck, sweeping away the fixed ropes, the only safe passage down the steepest, most exposed section of the mountain. In an instant, dozens of climbers were now stranded in the death zone, exhausted, oxygen-starved, and facing a night of chaos. The Norwegian climber Rolf Bay was swept to his death by the falling ice of the serac, witnessed by his wife Cecilia Skog and teammate Lars Nessa, who now had to descend without ropes or clear direction. But Rolf wasn't the only one. Frenchmen Hugh Dobared and Pakistani Karim Meherban also perished as victims from the serac fall. As the remaining climbers tried to descend, language barriers and exhaustion compounded the chaos. Marco Confortola, suffering from frostbite and shock, spent the night bivouacked with other survivors, watching as climbers disappeared into the darkness. Wilco van Rooijen, snowblind and hallucinating, wandered the upper slopes for nearly 60 hours, narrowly surviving after being found by rescuers. Despite the danger during that night, Pemba Sherpa repeatedly went back up the mountain to search for stranded climbers, risking his own life to guide down others. His efforts saved multiple lives, but he couldn't reach everyone. When Ger McDonnell descended, he was last seen helping 3 injured Korean climbers near the bottleneck. They were tangling in ropes, some of them visibly injured. But as Ger tried to get them back on their feet, another avalanche suddenly hit. Pemba Sherpa, who was lower down the mountain, could only watch in horrified silence as the 3 Koreans and Ger came crashing down the steep slope. The avalanche had swallowed all of them, and their bodies were never found. By dawn, the scale of the tragedy was clear. 11 climbers from 7 countries had died. The surviving climbers somehow staggered back to Camp 4, frostbitten and traumatized, carrying stories of split-second choices, failed equipment, and acts of selfless heroism. But unfortunately, the 2008 disaster goes down in history as the deadliest single event K2 has ever seen. If you've made it this far, and you enjoy watching videos like this, then please subscribe to my channel. It only takes 5 seconds, and it would help me a lot on my journey. Thank you. Atanas Skatov was not a typical high-altitude climber. As a former agronomist, he was known for his vegan lifestyle and his determination to prove that plant-based athletes could thrive in the harshest environments on Earth. Skatov had already summited several 8,000-meter peaks, including Everest, and was driven by a quiet, relentless ambition. For him, K2 in winter represented the ultimate test, a chance to join the elite few who dared to challenge the mountain at its most unforgiving. The 2021 winter season was a magnet for elite climbers. Teams from all over the world gathered at the camps, their tents battered by hurricane-force winds and temperatures plunging below -50 degrees. But despite the worsening conditions, spirits were high after the historic first winter ascent by a team of Nepali climbers. The Abruzzi spur was icy and exposed, the weather unpredictable, and every step above Camp 3 was a battle against the elements. On February 5th, Skatov and his team prepared for a push toward the summit. The plan was to move from Camp 3 to Camp 4 and then launch a final summit bid. The climb was grueling: icy slopes, deep snow, and a relentless wind that threatened to tear climbers from the mountain. Skatov, however, despite exhaustion, pressed on, his determination bigger than ever before. But K2's margin for error is razor thin, and at 7,300 meters they decided to turn back due to the dangerous conditions. As Skatov began his descent from Camp 3, what seemed to be a safer part of the mountain, something went terribly wrong. He decided to unclip from the fixed rope. Some said to pass another climber or to adjust his gear, just as he stepped onto a fragile snow ledge. But out of nowhere, the ledge gave way beneath him, and Skatov tumbled nearly 1,000 feet down the mountain's face. The climbers nearby were shocked. They could only watch in silence as their teammate vanished beneath them. When the news of his death reached base camp, shock and grief swept through the climbing community. A Pakistani rescue team later recovered his body far below and brought him to safety, but the damage had already been done. Skatov's story serves as a chilling reminder that even the smallest missteps on K2 can quickly result in your brutal end. Muhammad Hassan was not a seasoned high-altitude mountaineer. He was a porter who usually worked at lower altitudes, helping climbers ferry supplies up to base camp or the lower camps. But in summer of 2023, Hassan was offered a job to help fix ropes in the ultra-high, perilous altitudes above 8,000 meters. The promise of extra pay and the pressure to provide for his family convinced him to accept, despite his limited experience at such deadly heights. On July 27th, Hassan was part of the rope-fixing team climbing the bottleneck. But from the start, Hassan was at a disadvantage. His gear was inadequate for the notorious cold. His oxygen mask was barely functioning, and his clothing and boots were not up to the standards needed for the death zone. Despite these handicaps, he pressed on, determined to complete the dangerous job he'd been hired to do. But as Hassan navigated the steep, icy slope, something horrible was about to unfold. Out of nowhere, he slipped and fell, ending up hanging upside down from a rope. In the thin air and freezing temperatures, time was running out fast. And despite being surrounded by dozens of climbers, including Norwegian climber Kristin Harila and her team of over 10 people, almost no one stopped to help Hassan. Videos show how climbers stepped over his dying body. Harila's team was focused on their record-breaking summit push as well, and the summit, it seemed, was worth more than the life dangling in front of them. Drone footage captured Hassan's desperate struggle, laying helplessly on the slope for hours, exposed to the brutal cold. His cousin, who also worked as a porter that day, stayed with him for nearly 3 hours, somehow trying to get him back on his feet. But as his oxygen was running out, he eventually had to descend as well, with no choice but leaving his dying cousin at the bottleneck. And by the time the last climbers descended, Hassan was already gone. The footage of climbers completely ignoring him went viral within days and sparked a brutal question. Should climbers risk their own life to save others at the deadliest part of the mountain? Let me know in the comments what you think about that. In summer of 2024, Hassan's body was recovered high up the mountain by a team of Pakistani climbers and brought down to give his family a last chance to say goodbye. Willi Steindl, an Austrian mountaineer who was at base camp at the time of Hassan's death, started a GoFundMe for Hassan's wife and his 3 lovely children. Mountaineers, strangers, even those who had once passed him at the bottleneck, helped his family pay for the education of his 3 children, with almost $200,000 donated. The money couldn't bring Hassan back, but for his family, it was at least a small proof that the climbing community could come together to honor his memory and support those he had left behind. If you enjoyed watching this video, then please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. See you at the next video.